March 9th, 1945, 11:47 p.m. The Koto Ward district of eastern Tokyo. Yuki Nakamura, a 43-year-old machinist who had worked at the Nakajima aircraft plant until it was evacuated to Manchuria, stood on the roof of his two-story wooden house, scanning the night sky with the practiced eye of a man who had served as neighborhood air defense captain for 18 months. He could hear the air raid sirens wailing across the city, the third alert that evening, but he felt no particular alarm. The American B-29 bombers had been coming to Tokyo since November 1944, flying at 30,000 feet, dropping high-explosive bombs on industrial targets, and the raids had been more nuisance than catastrophe. The city's fire prevention measures were extensive. 2 million residents had been trained in firefighting. 300,000 buckets of water were positioned at street corners throughout the city. Firebreaks had been cleared through entire neighborhoods, and the Civilian Defense Organization had drilled relentlessly for exactly this scenario. Nakamura's own block association had rehearsed their procedures dozens of times, form bucket brigades, extinguish incendiary bombs before they could spread, evacuate to designated assembly areas if fire became uncontrollable. The system was comprehensive, organized, and had been proven effective during the smaller raids of previous months. Tonight, Nakamura heard the distant rumble of aircraft engines B-29 seconds, definitely, maybe 50 or 60 of them based on the sound, but he felt confident. 50 bombers attacking a city of 7 million people, a city that sprawled across 200 square kilometers, a city defended by 1,000 trained firefighting units and millions of prepared civilians. The mathematics seemed reassuring. They would drop their bombs, some buildings would burn, the fires would be contained by organized firefighting, and by morning the damage would be assessed and repairs would begin. Nakamura adjusted his helmet, checked that his bucket was filled with water, and prepared to do his duty, supremely confident that Tokyo's preparations would prove adequate to whatever the Americans brought tonight. What Nakamura didn't know, as he stood on that roof watching the eastern sky, was that the distant rumble he heard wasn't 50 B-29 seconds, but 334 B-29 superfortresses flying in formations that stretched across 40 miles of sky. Each aircraft loaded not with high-explosive bombs, but with an entirely different weapon. M69 incendiary cluster bombs filled with napalm gel, specifically designed to set fire to Japanese cities. More critically, Nakamura had no comprehension of what American industrial capacity and strategic bombing doctrine had created for this single night's operation. The 334 bombers were carrying 1,665 tons of incendiaries, approximately 500,000 individual M69 bomblets, and they were about to drop every single one of those bombs on a 16-square-mile target area in eastern Tokyo over a period of 3 hours. This wasn't a precision bombing raid aimed at factories or military installations. This wasn't a strategic strike intended to destroy specific infrastructure. This was a deliberate, systematic attempt to create a firestorm that would consume an entire district of Tokyo, kill tens of thousands of civilians, and demonstrate to Japan's leadership that American air power could destroy Japanese cities faster than they could be rebuilt. What was about to unfold over Tokyo in the next 3 hours wasn't combat, it was industrial-scale urban destruction. The concentrated application of American bombing capacity against a city built almost entirely from wood and paper, defended by fire prevention measures designed for conventional warfare rather than systematic incendiary attack. The fires were coming, and they were coming in numbers that would overwhelm every defensive preparation, every firefighting unit, every bucket brigade, every firebreak. Nakamura and his neighbors and the 1 million people living in eastern Tokyo were about to learn that when American industrial capacity focuses on destruction, no amount of preparation, discipline, or courage can prevent the outcome. The mathematics weren't on Tokyo's side. They never had been. The city of Tokyo in March 1945 was a metropolis designed to burn. The urban core was built primarily from wood, not because Japanese architects lacked knowledge of fire-resistant construction, but because earthquakes were common, and wooden structures survived seismic events better than brick or stone. The typical Tokyo residential district consisted of single- and two-story wooden houses, with paper screens, tiled roofs, and minimal separation between structures. In densely populated areas like Koto Ward, Sumida Ward, and Asakusa Ward, houses were often separated by less than 3 feet, and entire neighborhoods formed continuous wooden masses connected by narrow streets that were barely wide enough for handcarts. The city's population density in these eastern districts exceeded 100,000 people per square mile, approximately 4 times the density of Manhattan, and the combination of wooden construction and extreme density created what fire protection engineers would call an optimal environment for conflagration. The Japanese government understood this vulnerability and had implemented extensive fire prevention measures since 1943. They had established fire breaks by demolishing entire blocks of houses, creating cleared strips 100 to 200 feet wide that were supposed to stop fires from spreading. They had organized the population into neighborhood associations responsible for firefighting, with each association equipped with hand pumps, buckets, sand, and trained personnel. They had constructed 10,000 concrete water cisterns throughout the city to ensure water availability during raids. They had drilled civilians endlessly in fire prevention techniques, how to extinguish incendiary bombs with sand, how to form bucket brigades, how to evacuate in organized fashion. The entire system was predicated on a reasonable assumption that fires could be controlled if they were attacked quickly and systematically by organized firefighting forces. But the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan in early 1945 was predicated on a different assumption entirely: that Japanese cities could be destroyed by overwhelming their fire prevention capabilities with incendiary weapons delivered in such massive quantities that firefighting became impossible. The architect of this strategy was Major General Curtis LeMay, who had assumed command of the 21 Bomber Command in January 1945, and immediately recognized that the high-altitude precision bombing campaigns conducted over the previous months had been tactically ineffective. The B-29 seconds, flying at 30,000 feet to avoid Japanese anti-aircraft fire, encountered jet stream winds of 200+ miles per hour that made accurate bombing impossible. The raids were destroying some targets but consuming enormous quantities of fuel and bombs for minimal results. LeMay studied the problem and reached a radical conclusion: abandon precision bombing, adopt area incendiary attacks, fly at low altitude where accuracy improved and Japanese defenses were less effective, strip the B-29 seconds of most defensive armament to increase bomb load, and attack Japanese cities with massive concentrations of incendiary weapons, designed specifically to overwhelm firefighting capacity. The strategy was controversial. It meant deliberately targeting civilian areas, meant accepting that tens of thousands of non-combatants would die, meant transforming the bombing campaign from a military operation into systematic urban destruction. But LeMay believed it would work because he understood the fundamental vulnerability of Japanese cities and the overwhelming capacity of American bomber production and incendiary weapons manufacturing. The weapon that would implement this strategy was the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, a device that represented the culmination of 3 years of American research into the optimal method for burning Japanese cities. The M69 was a 6-pound bomblet, 19 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, filled with napalm gel that would ignite on impact and burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 6 minutes. Each M69 was packed with 37 similar bomblets into an E46 cluster that would open at 2,000 feet altitude, releasing the individual bomblets to scatter across an area approximately 100 feet in diameter. Each B-29 on the Tokyo raid was loaded with approximately 40 of these cluster bombs, 1,480 individual M69 bomblets per aircraft. When 334 B-29 seconds dropped their loads, approximately 495,000 individual napalm bomblets would fall across eastern Tokyo, each one capable of starting a separate fire, each one landing on wooden houses and paper screens and tiled roofs, each one burning intensely enough to ignite surrounding structures. The weapon system was designed with brutal clarity of purpose, deliver so many incendiary devices across such a concentrated area that firefighters would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of fires, that bucket brigades would be useless because there were too many fires to fight, that fire breaks would be irrelevant because fires would jump across them, that the entire targeted area would be consumed in a firestorm that would generate its own weather and kill through fire, asphyxiation, and thermal injury. The Americans had calculated that approximately 1 M69 per every 60 square feet would be sufficient to ensure complete destruction of a Japanese urban area. The planned drop of 495,000 bomblets over 16 square miles meant approximately 1 incendiary bomb per 100 square feet, 50% more than necessary, according to the calculations. The Americans weren't trying to damage Tokyo, they were trying to erase it. The industrial capacity required to execute this single raid illustrated the vast disparity between American and Japanese production capabilities in 1945. The 495,000 M69 incendiary bomblets dropped on Tokyo represented approximately 2 weeks of production from American incendiary weapons factories. The United States had established production facilities capable of manufacturing 5 million pounds of napalm per week, distributed across multiple plants, operated by chemical companies that had converted peacetime facilities for wartime production. The incendiary bomblet production involved assembly lines at multiple locations. The metal casings were manufactured at one facility. The napalm filling was produced at chemical plants. The ignition systems were assembled at ordnance factories, and the complete bomblets were packed into cluster bombs at ammunition depots. The entire production and logistics chain operated with such efficiency that the XXI Bomber Command had access to effectively unlimited supplies of incendiary weapons. When LeMay planned the Tokyo raid, he didn't need to calculate whether sufficient incendiaries were available. He knew they were available, knew they would continue to be available for future raids, knew that American production capacity could sustain this level of incendiary bombardment indefinitely. The 1,665 tons of incendiaries dropped on Tokyo on March 10th represented approximately 0.5% of American monthly incendiary weapons production. The raid could be repeated every night for months without straining American production capacity. The logistics system that delivered those incendiaries to Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, where the B-29 seconds were based, involved Liberty ships crossing the Pacific, port battalions unloading bombs, ordnance companies storing and distributing weapons, and ground crews loading bombers, all operating as routine parts of a supply chain that stretched 6,000 miles from American factories to Japanese cities. The B-29 superfortress itself represented an industrial achievement that was beyond Japanese manufacturing capability to replicate. Each aircraft cost $639,000 to produce, equivalent to approximately $10 million in current dollars, and represented 60,000 hours of skilled labor. The B-29 had a wingspan of 141 feet, weighed 120,000 pounds fully loaded, could fly at 350 miles per hour, had a service ceiling of 31,850 feet, possessed a range of 3,250 miles, and was equipped with pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled defensive guns, and sophisticated navigation and bombing systems. The United States had manufactured 3,970 B-29 seconds between 1,943 and 1,945, each one built on production lines at facilities in Kansas, Georgia, Nebraska, and Washington State. The B-29 production program had cost $3 billion more than the Manhattan Project and had employed 100,000 workers at peak production. By March 1945, the 21 Bomber Command had 600 B-29 seconds available in the Mariana Islands, with sufficient maintenance personnel, spare parts, fuel, and ammunition to conduct large-scale raids every few days indefinitely. The raid on Tokyo involved 334 aircraft, more B-29 seconds than Japan had operational aircraft of all types remaining in the home islands. Japan's entire aircraft production in early 1945 was approximately 1,500 aircraft per month, most of them fighters and light bombers, none with the range or payload capacity of the B-29. The industrial gap was stark. America was producing 4-engine heavy bombers at a rate of approximately 140 per month, while Japan was struggling to produce single-engine fighters with chronic shortages of aluminum, engine parts, and trained pilots. At 12:15 a.m. on March 10th, The first B-29 seconds crossed the coast of Tokyo Bay, flying at 7,000 feet, dramatically lower than the usual 30,000-foot bombing altitude. The aircraft were stripped of most defensive armament to maximize bomb load, gambling that Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft fire would be less effective at low altitude than the increased payload would be valuable. The lead bombardier in the Pathfinder aircraft, specially equipped B-29 seconds, whose job was to mark the target area with incendiaries, opened his bomb bay doors and released his load over the designated aiming point in Koto Ward. Clusters of M69 bomblets fell through the cold night air, the E-46 cluster casings opening at 2,000 feet, 1,480 individual bomblets scattering across the neighborhood below. Each bomblet struck a roof, penetrated through tiles and wooden beams, and ignited inside houses, shops, and small factories. Within 90 seconds, over 1,000 individual fires were burning across a quarter-mile radius. The second Pathfinder aircraft dropped its load 500 yards west of the first, and another 1,000 fires erupted. The third and fourth Pathfinders bracketed the target area, and within 5 minutes, a rough X pattern of fires was burning across Koto Ward, marking the boundaries of the target area for the main bomber force following behind. Nakamura, standing on his roof 2 miles from the initial impact point, saw the fires blossom across the eastern horizon and felt his first flutter of real concern. That was more fires than he had ever seen, more than the previous raids had generated, and they seemed to be spreading with unusual speed. The main force of 330 B-29 seconds began dropping their loads at 12:20 a.m., and the character of the attack transformed from precision raid to systematic area bombardment. The bombers flew in streams over the target area, each aircraft dropping its 40 cluster bombs as it crossed the designated zone, the bombardiers releasing their loads not at specific targets but simply across the marked area below. The raid had been planned with geometric precision. The target area was 16 square miles. The bombers would approach in 3 streams from different directions, and the drops would create overlapping coverage that would ensure no part of the target area escaped bombardment. Each aircraft needed approximately 90 seconds to cross the target zone and drop its full load, meaning that every 90 seconds, 1,480 more incendiary bomblets were falling on eastern Tokyo. For 3 hours, from 12:15 a.m. until 3:15 a.m., the bombers came in continuous waves, the sky filled with aircraft, the ground below carpeted with falling incendiaries. The American planning had calculated that this rate of bombardment would deliver approximately 165,000 incendiary bomblets per hour to the target area, meaning that every second, 45 separate napalm fires were starting somewhere in eastern Tokyo. The mathematics of firefighting made the outcome inevitable. If you start 45 new fires every second for 3 hours, you create 486,000 fires faster than any firefighting system can possibly extinguish them. The fires would merge, would create conflagrations, would overwhelm all defensive measures. Tokyo's fire prevention system had been designed to handle perhaps 1,000 simultaneous fires across the entire city. It was about to face 100,000 simultaneous fires in 16 square miles. Nakamura watched the sky fill with incendiary bombs, watched fires erupt across his neighborhood like flowers blooming in accelerated time, and understood within 5 minutes that every assumption underlying Tokyo's fire defense system was wrong. The bucket of water on his roof was useless. There were 50 fires within view, too many to fight with buckets. The hand pump at the corner was useless. The nearest fires were already too large to extinguish with pumped water. The neighborhood fire brigade was useless. They were trained to fight 10 or 20 fires, not hundreds. The firebreak 3 blocks away was useless. Fires were starting on both sides of it simultaneously, rendering the cleared space meaningless. The concrete water cisterns were useless. There were only 2 on his block, and hundreds of fires. Every element of the fire defense system had been designed to handle fires that started sequentially and could be attacked individually by organized firefighting forces. The American incendiary bombardment was creating fires simultaneously across the entire district, starting faster than they could be fought, merging into masses of flame that consumed entire blocks in minutes. Nakamura watched an incendiary bomb crash through the roof of his neighbor's house 2 doors down, watched flames erupt from the windows seconds later, watched the fire spread to the adjacent house within a minute, watched both houses transform into pyres within 3 minutes. He abandoned his bucket and ran downstairs to evacuate his family, his wife, his 70-year-old mother, his 2 children aged 8 and 11, shouting at them to grab emergency packs and head for the designated evacuation area by the river. They were running before his mother could ask questions, joining a stream of neighbors fleeing into streets that were already filled with smoke and burning debris. The fires created by the incendiary bombardment didn't simply burn, they merged and intensified through a phenomenon that Allied fire protection engineers had deliberately planned for: the firestorm. As thousands of individual fires consumed wooden structures across eastern Tokyo, they generated enormous amounts of heat that rose rapidly into the cold night air, creating powerful updrafts. These updrafts drew fresh oxygen into the fire zone at ground level, creating winds that blew toward the fire rather than away from it. The winds grew stronger as the fires grew larger, eventually reaching velocities of 50 to 70 miles per hour hurricane-force winds blowing toward the center of the fire zone, carrying sparks and burning debris, spreading fires across firebreaks, igniting buildings that hadn't been hit by incendiaries. The firestorm became self-sustaining and self-amplifying. More fire created stronger updrafts. Stronger updrafts created stronger winds. Stronger winds fed more oxygen to the fire and spread the flames faster, causing more fire. By 1:30 a.m., 90 minutes into the raid, the individual fires that had started across Koto Ward and Sumida Ward had merged into a single fire mass approximately 4 square miles in size, burning with such intensity that the updrafts were visible as a column of smoke and flame that rose 10,000 feet into the night sky. The temperature at ground level in the center of the firestorm exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal, to boil water instantly, to ignite wood through radiant heat alone without flame contact. People who fled into the fire zone's center didn't die from flames but from breathing superheated air that charred their lungs and airways, or from oxygen depletion as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen, or from radiant heat that caused clothing to ignite spontaneously. The human experience of being trapped in the Tokyo firestorm was documented in hundreds of survivor accounts collected after the war, and the testimonies reveal the systematic horror of what happened when industrial bombing capacity overwhelmed urban areas. Survivors described streets filled with fleeing crowds, where people collapsed from heat and asphyxiation faster than bodies could be cleared, creating human obstacles that trapped others. They described mothers carrying children who were forced to abandon the children because the heat made it impossible to continue carrying them. They described elderly people who sat down in the streets to rest and died within seconds from oxygen depletion. They described canals and rivers that filled with thousands of people seeking refuge from the flames, where many drowned or died from hypothermia in the cold water, while those who stayed on the banks burned to death. They described attempting to shelter in concrete buildings or air raid shelters, only to die from oxygen depletion as the firestorm consumed all breathable air. They described winds so strong they knocked people off their feet and blew them into fires. They described watching their homes, their neighborhoods, their entire world transform from familiar urban landscape into an inferno that killed indiscriminately young and old, healthy and sick, prepared and unprepared. The firestorm didn't care about fire prevention training or bucket brigades or organized evacuation. It was a force of nature, deliberately created by American bombing doctrine, that killed through multiple mechanisms simultaneously and gave survivors only one option: flee toward the edges of the fire zone and hope you could outrun the flames. Nakamura and his family fled west, toward the Imperial Palace and the broader streets of central Tokyo, joining tens of thousands of other refugees streaming away from the eastern districts. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes took 3 hours because the streets were clogged with crowds, because smoke reduced visibility to a few feet, because hurricane-force winds made walking difficult, because burning debris fell constantly from the sky. Nakamura's mother collapsed after a mile, unable to continue, and he faced the terrible calculation that thousands of other Tokyo residents faced that night: abandon her and save his wife and children, or stop to help her and risk everyone dying. He chose his children, lifted his mother into his arms, staggering under her weight, determined to carry her until his strength failed. His wife carried their youngest child. Their 8-year-old held her hand, and the family moved through smoke and flame and crowds of fleeing refugees, the heat intense even a mile from the fire zone center. They passed bodies in the streets, people who had collapsed and died, people who had been trampled in the panic, people who had simply given up and sat down to await death. They passed burning buildings where families were trapped on upper floors, screaming for help that would never come because the fire department was overwhelmed and there was no help available. They passed overturned carts where refugees had abandoned their possessions to flee faster. At 2:15 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the bombing began, Nakamura reached the edge of the fire zone and collapsed on the grounds of a temple in Chiyoda Ward. His mother miraculously still alive, his family intact, his world destroyed. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, attempting to coordinate rescue and firefighting operations from their headquarters in central Tokyo, realized by 1:00 a.m. that the situation was beyond their capacity to manage. The department's firefighting resources consisted of 1,000 trained firefighting units equipped with hand pumps, hoses, and ladders, equipment designed for fighting structure fires, not city-wide conflagrations. The water system was failing because the heat from the fires was so intense it was melting water mains, because the earthquake-induced breaks in pipes were allowing water to drain uselessly into the ground, because demand from thousands of firefighting crews exceeded supply. The fire trucks that responded to the eastern districts found streets impassable due to burning debris, crowds, and collapsed buildings. Firefighters who reached the fire zone's center found conditions so extreme, temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees, winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, oxygen depletion, smoke so dense it caused immediate respiratory distress that they couldn't operate. Many firefighters died attempting to fight fires in the firestorm zone. Others retreated and focused on defending central Tokyo, attempting to prevent the fire from spreading west into the commercial and government districts. The police department's casualty reports recorded 125 firefighters killed or missing during the March 10th raid, and the reports noted with bureaucratic precision that these deaths had accomplished nothing because the fires these men had died trying to fight had burned unchecked, regardless of their efforts. The firefighting system that Tokyo had prepared over 2 years, that had cost millions of yen and employed thousands of personnel, that had seemed comprehensive and professional, had proven completely ineffective against systematic incendiary bombardment designed to overwhelm it. The American bomber crews, flying over Tokyo at 7,000 feet during the raid, reported experiencing turbulence from the firestorm's updrafts, so violent that aircraft were buffeted thousands of feet up and down despite their altitude. The heat rising from the city below was so intense that pilots reported the smell of burning wood and flesh inside their pressurized cabins, and several bombardiers vomited from the sight and smell of the destruction they were causing. The crews could see the firestorm clearly, a glowing mass 4 miles across that illuminated the night sky, bright enough to read by, with flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, with smoke rising in a column that extended above the bomber's flight altitude. Several crew members later reported that the visual spectacle was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Awe-inspiring because the scale of destruction was so vast it didn't seem real. Terrifying because they understood they were killing thousands of people, and there was nothing those people could do to escape. The B-29 seconds continued their bombing runs despite the turbulence, despite the visual horror, despite some crews' reluctance to continue, because the mission profile called for complete bombardment of the target area and military discipline required them to execute their orders. By 3:15 a.m., when the last bomber dropped its final load and turned for the flight back to Saipan, the crews had delivered 1,665 tons of incendiaries. With remarkable precision, approximately 80% of bombs fell within the designated target area, and the resulting firestorm had consumed nearly 16 square miles of urban Tokyo. The Japanese air defense system, which had been prepared for high-altitude bomber attacks, proved almost completely ineffective against the low-altitude incendiary raid. The anti-aircraft guns positioned around Tokyo were primarily 75mm and 88mm weapons, designed to engage bombers at 20,000 to 30,000 feet. Against bombers flying at 7,000 feet, the anti-aircraft fire was less effective because the guns had to be depressed to lower elevations, reducing their field of fire. The night fighters scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, primarily Ki-45 twin-engine fighters and Ki-84 single-engine fighters, managed to intercept some bombers, but faced the fundamental problem that they were outnumbered 50 to 1 and lacked the radar equipment necessary for effective night interception. The Japanese fighters shot down 14 B-29 seconds during the raid, a loss rate of 4.2% that was considered acceptable by American standards, while losing 17 fighters to defensive fire from the bombers and to crashes during night operations. The exchange ratio favored the Americans dramatically, losing 14 bombers to destroy 16 square miles of urban area and kill approximately 100,000 people was, from a cold strategic calculation, an extraordinary success. The Japanese air defense system had been designed to protect against precision bombing raids that targeted specific factories or military installations. It had no answer to area bombardment by hundreds of bombers dropping incendiaries across entire districts, because intercepting even 50 bombers out of 334 still left 284 bombers free to drop their loads and create the firestorm. The only effective defense against this type of raid would have been to intercept all the bombers before they reached Tokyo, and Japan lacked the aircraft, pilots, radar, and air defense doctrine to accomplish that. By dawn on March 10th, the firestorm had burned itself out, having consumed approximately 16 square miles of eastern Tokyo in 5 hours of uncontrolled conflagration. The devastation was absolute and systematic. Approximately 267,000 buildings had been destroyed, not damaged, destroyed, reduced to ash and rubble. An estimated 1 million people were homeless, having lost everything they owned. The death toll was initially estimated at 80,000, but later revised upward to approximately 100,000 killed, making the Tokyo firebombing the single most destructive conventional bombing raid in history, more lethal than either of the atomic bombings that would occur 5 months later. The casualty rate in the target area exceeded 10%, meaning that 1 out of every 10 people living in eastern Tokyo on March 9th was dead by the morning of March 10th. The survivors who returned to their neighborhoods found landscapes transformed into lunar expanses of ash and twisted metal, with corpses so numerous that military and civilian work crews spent weeks collecting bodies and cremating them in mass pyres because individual burial was impossible. The Sumida River, where thousands had sought refuge, contained so many bodies that the water was dammed by human remains, and recovery crews used boats to pull corpses from the water for weeks after the raid. The hospitals in western Tokyo, which had escaped the bombing, were overwhelmed with burn victims, smoke inhalation cases, and trauma patients. But medical personnel could do little because burns covering more than 40% of the body were usually fatal with 1,945 medical technology, and most firestorm survivors had burns exceeding that threshold. The Imperial Japanese government's response to the Tokyo firebombing revealed the complete inadequacy of Japan's civil defense and recovery systems to cope with this level of destruction. The Home Ministry, responsible for civil defense, issued instructions for neighborhood associations to organize cleanup efforts, for homeless residents to seek shelter with relatives in undamaged areas, for industrial workers to report to alternative work sites. But these instructions assumed a level of social organization and administrative capacity that no longer existed in the burned districts. Entire neighborhood associations had been wiped out, every resident dead, every official dead, every building destroyed. The survivors were in shock, traumatized, desperate to find family members, in no condition to organize cleanup efforts. The government attempted to provide relief supplies, rice, water, tents, medical supplies. But the logistics of delivering supplies to 1 million homeless people across a devastated urban area exceeded available transportation and administrative capacity. The national rice stockpile was critically low due to failed harvests and shipping interdiction, meaning that feeding 1 million additional refugees would require reducing rations for the rest of Tokyo's population. The medical system was overwhelmed because there weren't enough burn treatment facilities, enough morphine, enough bandages, enough plasma for transfusions. The burial system collapsed because crematorium capacity was approximately 3,000 bodies per day, and there were 100,000 bodies to dispose of. Every system failed simultaneously, and the government's response devolved into triage: provide minimal aid to keep the survivors alive, focus resources on maintaining order and preventing social collapse, accept that full recovery was impossible, and prepare for additional raids. Because the Americans weren't finished. The March 10th raid on Tokyo was the first in a systematic campaign of firebombing that would target every major Japanese city over the next 5 months. LeMay had proven his strategy worked. Low-altitude incendiary raids could destroy Japanese urban areas with acceptable bomber losses, and Japan lacked the defensive capacity to prevent these raids. Over the following weeks, the 21 Bomber Command conducted similar raids against Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, Japan's second, third, and fourth largest cities, using the same tactics that had worked at Tokyo. Each raid involved 300-plus B-29 seconds, each aircraft carrying 1,500-plus incendiary bomblets, each bombardment creating firestorms that consumed square miles of urban area. By the end of March 1945, American bombers had destroyed approximately 40 square miles of Japanese urban area, killed an estimated 150,000 people, and rendered 2 million Japanese civilians homeless. The industrial capacity that enabled this campaign was staggering. The United States was producing incendiary weapons faster than they could be dropped, was manufacturing B-29 seconds faster than they were being lost, was training bomber crews faster than casualties were depleting the force. Japan had no counter to this campaign, because countering it would have required either destroying the B-29 bases in the Mariana Islands, impossible with Japan's limited naval and air forces, or intercepting such a high percentage of bombers that the raids became unsustainable, impossible with Japan's limited fighter strength and lack of effective air defense radar. The strategic bombing campaign had become systematic urban destruction, and Japan could only endure it until the Americans chose to stop, or until Japanese cities were completely destroyed. The human testimony from survivors of the Tokyo firebombing reveals the psychological impact of experiencing destruction on this scale. A diary entry from March 11th, written by Michiko Kiyo, a schoolteacher who had survived the raid in Sumida Ward, was preserved in the Tokyo Metropolitan Archives. I no longer understand what we are fighting for, or how we can continue fighting. Yesterday morning I lived in a city. I had a home, a school where I taught, neighbors I knew, streets I walked daily, shops where I bought food. By this morning, all of that has ceased to exist. My neighborhood is ash. My school is ash. My neighbors are dead or missing. The city I knew for 40 years has been erased in one night by American bombs that fell like rain, that started fires faster than we could count them, that created winds that killed people a mile from the nearest flame. The government tells us to show fighting spirit, to persevere, to accept sacrifice for the nation. But what does sacrifice mean when 100,000 people die in a single night? What does perseverance mean when entire districts of the capital are destroyed faster than they could be evacuated? What does fighting spirit matter when the Americans can create storms of fire that kill regardless of courage? I watched people die last night, who did everything right. They evacuated promptly. They helped neighbors. They followed instructions. They moved towards safety, and they died anyway because there were too many fires and too much smoke and too much heat, and nowhere truly safe. The Americans have discovered how to burn cities, and we have no defense against it. We built our homes from wood, because wood survives earthquakes better than stone. The Americans invented bombs specifically to burn wood. We organized neighborhood firefighting associations. The Americans dropped so many incendiaries that fighting fires became impossible. We created firebreaks. The Americans' fires jumped across them. Every preparation we made was correct for fighting conventional fires. And none of it mattered because the Americans aren't fighting conventional fires, they're creating artificial infernos that overwhelm everything. I don't know how we can win this war. I don't know how we can even survive it if the Americans can do this to Tokyo whenever they choose. The entry ended there. Michiko Kiyo died 3 weeks later during a firebombing raid on Kawasaki. where she had relocated after losing her home in Tokyo. The strategic impact of the firebombing campaign extended beyond the physical destruction of Japanese cities to the collapse of Japanese war production and military effectiveness. The raids on Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe destroyed not just residential areas but also the small-scale manufacturing facilities that were integrated throughout Japanese urban areas. Japan's military production in 1945 relied heavily on distributed manufacturing, thousands of small shops and factories, producing components that were assembled at larger facilities. The aircraft industry, for example, involved major assembly plants but also hundreds of subcontractors producing engines, instruments, electrical systems, and other components. When the firebombing destroyed residential districts, it also destroyed these small manufacturing facilities because they were located in the same neighborhoods. The loss of production capacity was devastating. Japanese aircraft production fell from 1,500 aircraft per month in January 1945 to fewer than 800 per month by May 1945, not primarily because assembly plants were destroyed, but because the subcontractors who made critical components were burned out. The same pattern affected every industry. Ordnance production fell by 40%. Vehicle production fell by 50%. Ship construction virtually ceased. The American firebombing campaign had accidentally discovered that destroying Japanese cities was more effective at reducing war production than precision bombing of factories, because the cities contained the workers and the small-scale manufacturing infrastructure that kept the factories running. The disparity in strategic capabilities that the firebombing campaign revealed was fundamental and irreversible. The United States was waging strategic bombing from bases 1,500 miles from Japan, using aircraft that cost $639,000 each, dropping bombs manufactured in chemical plants operated by corporations like Dow and DuPont, supported by a logistics system that stretched across the Pacific Ocean, and the entire campaign operated as a routine military operation that consumed a tiny fraction of American industrial capacity. Japan had no equivalent capability and no way to develop one. Japanese bombers couldn't reach American cities because the distances were too great. Japanese industry couldn't produce 4-engine heavy bombers in quantity because the industrial capacity wasn't available. Japanese chemical industry couldn't manufacture napalm in large quantities because the required chemical feedstocks were unavailable. Japanese logistics couldn't support strategic bombing because the merchant fleet had been destroyed by American submarines. Even if Japan had somehow developed a strategic bombing capability, American cities were built from brick, steel, and concrete materials that were far less vulnerable to incendiary attack than Japanese wood and paper construction. The asymmetry was total. America could burn Japanese cities with impunity, while Japan could not retaliate in any meaningful way. This one-sided nature of the strategic bombing campaign created a psychological crisis in Japanese leadership because it demonstrated that Japan's defensive strategy was fundamentally flawed. The plan had been to make an American invasion so costly that negotiation would become preferable. But if America could simply burn Japanese cities from the air without risking invasion, then the defensive strategy collapsed. Japan would lose the war not through invasion but through systematic destruction from the air, and there was nothing Japanese forces could do to prevent it. By May 1945, the American firebombing campaign had destroyed approximately 105 square miles of Japanese urban area across 40 major cities. The death toll exceeded 300,000 civilians, with another 8 million people rendered homeless. The industrial impact was equally severe. Japanese military production had fallen to approximately 50% of January levels. Not because of precision bombing, but because firebombing had destroyed the dispersed manufacturing infrastructure and killed or displaced the workers. The combined chiefs of staff estimated that if the firebombing campaign continued at current intensity for another 6 months, Japanese war production would fall to less than 20% of peak levels, and Japanese civilian morale would collapse completely. The campaign was achieving its strategic objectives, forcing Japanese leadership to confront the reality that continuing the war meant systematic destruction of Japanese cities and death of Japanese civilians on a scale that made military defeat inevitable. The firebombing campaign was, in essence, a form of strategic coercion Surrender or watch your cities burn. This wasn't how strategic bombing had been conceived in the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, when theorists like Giulio Douhet had argued that bombing would target military and industrial facilities and spare civilians. This was something darker and more terrible: the deliberate use of industrial bombing capacity to create humanitarian catastrophes that would force political surrender. The Japanese response to the firebombing campaign was to disperse the population from cities to rural areas, to attempt relocating critical industries underground, and to prepare for Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the home islands. The government evacuated approximately 3 million people from major cities between March and August 1945, sending children to rural relatives, encouraging workers to relocate to smaller towns, and systematically reducing urban populations to minimize casualties from future raids. But this evacuation strategy had severe economic costs. It reduced the workforce available for war production, disrupted transportation networks, and consumed food resources in rural areas that were already struggling with failed harvests. The underground factory construction was similarly problematic. Japan lacked the earth-moving equipment, concrete, steel, and engineering capacity to build large underground facilities quickly, and the few facilities that were constructed operated at greatly reduced efficiency because of ventilation problems, lighting difficulties, and logistics challenges. The Ketsugo strategy, positioning millions of soldiers and civilian militia to resist American invasion, was predicated on the assumption that Japan could sustain its population and military through invasion season. But the firebombing campaign was destroying Japanese cities faster than they could be evacuated. By August 1945, Japanese leadership faced the grim calculation that continuing the war would result in complete destruction of Japanese urban areas, death of millions of civilians, and eventual military defeat anyway, because America's industrial capacity to create destruction exceeded Japan's capacity to sustain or endure that destruction. The final statistics of the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan revealed the overwhelming scale of industrial warfare when applied to urban destruction. Between March and August 1945, American B-29 seconds flew 33,000 sorties against Japanese cities, dropped 160,000 tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs, destroyed approximately 180 square miles of urban area, killed an estimated 400,000 civilians, and rendered 15 million people homeless. The campaign consumed approximately 20% of American monthly incendiary weapons production, meaning that 80% of production went into stockpiles for future use or was diverted to other theaters. The B-29 force suffered 414 aircraft lost in combat and 450 lost to operational accidents, approximately 3% loss rate for combat losses, which was considered acceptable by American standards. The average cost per square mile of urban area destroyed was approximately $1 million in bombs and fuel, plus the operational cost of aircraft and crews, meaning that the United States had spent approximately $180 million to destroy 180 square miles of Japanese cities. This cost-benefit analysis seemed reasonable to American strategic planners. Spending hundreds of millions of dollars to destroy Japanese industrial capacity and break Japanese will to fight was cheaper and faster than invading the home islands, which was projected to cost tens of thousands of American casualties and take over a year of continued combat. The strategic bombing campaign was, from a purely economic perspective, an efficient method of warfare. It traded American industrial capacity for Japanese cities. And since America had abundant industrial capacity while Japan had irreplaceable cities, the trade favored America decisively. The ethical implications of the firebombing campaign were debated during and after the war, with critics arguing that deliberately targeting civilian populations violated the laws of war and basic humanitarian principles. The American government's position was that the raids were legitimate because Japanese cities contained military production facilities, because Japanese workers supported the war effort, and because there was no practical way to distinguish between military and civilian targets in Japanese urban areas where small-scale manufacturing was integrated into residential districts. This justification was legally questionable. The Hague Conventions and customary international law prohibited attacks deliberately targeting civilians, but it reflected the reality that modern industrial warfare had blurred the distinction between military and civilian targets. In total war, where entire economies are mobilized for war production, civilians become part of the war effort, and targeting the workforce becomes militarily rational, even if ethically problematic. The firebombing campaign represented the full embrace of this logic. If Japanese civilians were supporting the war effort through their labor, then destroying their homes, their workshops, and their lives was a legitimate military objective. The human cost, 400,000 civilian deaths, 15 million homeless, was acknowledged, but considered acceptable in the context of forcing Japanese surrender without invasion. This cold calculation reflected the fundamental nature of industrial warfare. It reduces human beings to statistics, cities to targets, and ethical considerations to strategic constraints that can be overridden when military necessity requires it. The testimony that perhaps best captured the Japanese perspective on the firebombing came from a September 1945 interrogation of Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, conducted by American intelligence officers after the surrender. The transcript included this exchange. Question: in your assessment, what were the primary factors leading to Japan's decision to accept surrender? Kawabe: the atomic bombs demonstrated American technological superiority and made continued resistance seem futile. But the firebombing campaign, which preceded the atomic attacks, had already broken our capacity to wage war effectively. Beginning with the Tokyo raid on March 10, your forces systematically destroyed our cities with a level of efficiency and destructiveness that exceeded our comprehension. We calculated after that first Tokyo raid that if you continued at that rate, every major Japanese city would be destroyed within 6 months. Our analysis proved accurate by August. 67 cities had been partially or completely destroyed by incendiary bombing. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound. We understood that we faced an enemy who possessed both the capacity and willingness to destroy Japanese civilization itself. You could burn our cities faster than we could evacuate them, kill civilians faster than we could disperse populations, destroy industrial capacity faster than we could relocate it. Every defensive measure we implemented, evacuation, dispersal, underground facilities, was overwhelmed by the scale of your attacks. The firebombing campaign demonstrated that American industrial capacity had made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. You were not fighting a military campaign against Japan, you were conducting systematic destruction of the Japanese nation, and you had the resources to continue that destruction until nothing remained. How does one fight against that? The answer is that one cannot fight against it. One can only surrender and hope for mercy. The atomic bombs ended the war, but the firebombing campaign had already demonstrated that continuing the war was suicide for Japan as a nation. We were not defeated by your soldiers or your strategy. We were defeated by your factories, your production capacity, your ability to create weapons of mass destruction and deliver them to our cities with industrial efficiency. This is the nature of modern warfare, and Japan was not prepared for it. The firebombing of Tokyo and the subsequent strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities represented the culmination of industrial warfare's evolution towards systematic destruction as a military strategy. The campaign demonstrated that modern industrial nations could produce weapons of mass destruction, not atomic weapons but conventional incendiary weapons in quantities sufficient to erase cities, that these weapons could be delivered by aircraft that themselves represented massive industrial investments, that the entire campaign could be sustained indefinitely by industrial production and logistics systems, and that the only limit on destruction was the attacker's willingness to continue rather than any defensive capacity by the defender. This was warfare reduced to its most fundamental equation. Industrial capacity equals destructive capacity, and the side with greater industry will destroy the side with lesser industry if the will to do so exists. Japan had entered the war believing that fighting spirit, tactical skill, and strategic insight could compensate for industrial inferiority. The firebombing campaign demolished that belief with systematic efficiency, burning city after city, until Japanese leadership accepted that continued resistance meant continued destruction, and that surrender was the only rational choice. The story ends, as these stories must, with fire and ash and silence. Tokyo rebuilt, slowly, painfully, rising from the ashes like the phoenix of mythology. But the city that emerged was different from the city that burned, built with concrete and steel rather than wood and paper, spread wider and lower rather than dense and compact, shaped by the memory of March 10th in ways that persist even today. The Sumida River still flows through Tokyo, but the parks along its banks are memorials to the 100,000 who died in the firestorm, and each March 10th survivors gather to remember the night when fire fell from the sky in numbers beyond counting. The M69 incendiary bomblets that rained on Tokyo are gone now, expended in that campaign of destruction or decommissioned afterward, but the lesson they taught remains etched in history. That modern warfare is decided by industrial production, that nations with greater manufacturing capacity can create destruction faster than nations with lesser capacity can sustain or endure that destruction, and that when American industrial capacity focused on destruction, no defensive preparation, no fighting spirit, no tactical skill could prevent the outcome. The equation was written in fire across Japanese cities. 495,000 incendiary bomblets plus systematic bombardment doctrine plus industrial logistics equals 100,000 dead in a single night. And the equation could be repeated indefinitely, because American factories produced incendiaries faster than Japanese cities could burn. Japan had built a military strategy on courage and had encountered an enemy whose strategy was production, and production overwhelmed courage through sheer mathematics of fire. In the end, Tokyo burned not because Japanese defenders lacked preparation, but because American industry had solved urban destruction as an engineering problem, had manufactured the solution in quantity, and had delivered that solution with industrial efficiency. The fires consumed wood and paper and lives, and they taught the final lesson of the Pacific War. You cannot fight factories with fortitude, and abundance weaponized always overwhelms scarcity, regardless of how bravely scarcity is defended.